The grand chamber of the Galactic Concord resonated with a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. Light, ancient and hallowed, streamed through vast crystalline archways, illuminating motes of dust that had danced in these halls for millennia. Here, on the citadel that hung in the void between a binary star's embrace, the fate of civilizations was weighed, and today the weight was unbearable. High Executor Vorlag of the Cathar, his obsidian carapace absorbing the soft light and giving nothing back, stood immobile at his designated dais. His four multifaceted eyes, two facing forward and two angled to perceive the periphery, took in the assembly. He saw the shimmering, gaseous forms of the lumina, their thoughts rippling as visible colors through their bodies. He saw the stoic, granite-skinned Jelker, their heavy-lidded eyes betraying nothing of their notoriously pragmatic calculations. He saw representatives from countless worlds, a living tapestry of galactic history, all bound by the Concord's founding promise, unity against the darkness. But the darkness they feared was a ghost, a memory. The new uncertainty was a living, breathing thing, and it came from a species that still smelled of their home world's oceans and soil, humanity. The very name had become a hushed source of discord in the hallowed halls. They were young, a flicker in the long night of galactic time. They had been welcomed as promising upstarts, their volatile emotions seen as a charming, if naive, flaw. Their art was passionate, their science explosive, their diplomacy earnest to the point of being quaint. They were considered junior partners, apprentices in the grand, slow-moving game of cosmic governance. The Concord, led by the elder races who had survived the Scourge Wars, had offered them protection, technology, and a place among the stars. In return, they asked only for adherence to the Concord's long-established truths, the historical bedrock upon which their millennia of peace was built. But the humans, it seemed, had a problem with bedrock. They had a tendency to dig. Vorlag adjusted his posture, a motion so slight it was nearly imperceptible, yet it sent a subtle tremor through the resonant floor of his dais. The emergency session had been called by the Lumina, whose prescient abilities were often dismissed as poetic ambiguity but were ignored at the Concord's peril. Their representative, a swirling cloud of iridescent violet, had pulsed a single, disquieting thought into the chamber's translation sphere. The harmony is fractured. A note of dissonance rings from the Sol system. It is a chord of cold iron. The chamber had devolved into anxious debate since. The Jelker Primarch argued for containment, for a preemptive quarantine of the human systems. Their expansion is too rapid, the Primarch's synthesized voice had ground out like stone on stone. Their emotional core makes them unstable. We have seen such species before. They burn brightly, and then they burn everything around them. Others had argued for patience, for understanding. But all of them felt it, a shift in the cosmic balance, a change in the way the humans looked out at the galaxy. Their ships, once painted in colors of exploration and hope, were now seen patrolling their borders in stark, functional grays and blacks. Their diplomatic channels, once filled with endless cultural exchanges and scientific queries, had grown quiet, formal, and unnervingly concise. And now the true crisis. An entire human diplomatic armada had translated from hyperspace at the edge of the Citadel's exclusion zone unannounced. They had not hailed the Concord. They had not requested permission to approach. They simply hung there in the black, a silent, disciplined formation of warships escorting a single, immense diplomatic vessel. Their message, when it finally came, was not a request. It was a summons. They had demanded an immediate, full session of the Concord Council. They would address the assembly on a matter of foundational truth. The arrogance was breathtaking. The implications were terrifying. Vorlag's mind, a consciousness that had seen empires rise and fall, replayed his last interaction with the human ambassador, a woman named Evelyn Reed. He had found her fascinating. Her species lived for a mere century, yet she spoke with a sense of history that felt ancient. She was calm, always calm, but Vorlag's Cathar senses, which could perceive the subtle chemical changes in the air that betrayed emotion, had always detected a deep, powerful current running beneath her placid surface. It was not fear, not ambition, but something he had no name for. A kind of terrible, unyielding focus, as if her entire being was aimed at a singular point in the future. He had underestimated it. They all had. They had seen human emotion as a weakness, a source of irrationality. They had never considered that it could be forged into a weapon of such cold, implacable resolve. The great doors at the far end of the chamber, forged from the heart of a collapsed star, began to part. A low, resonant hum filled the air, a sound that had heralded the arrival of kings and the signing of treaties that had shaped the galaxy. But this time it felt different. It felt like the sound of a tomb being opened. The assembled delegates stirred, their appendages, tentacles, and energy fields shifting with a collective anxiety. Vorlag focused two of his eyes on the widening aperture, while his other two scanned the reactions of the council members. He saw fear in the flickering light of the lumina, contempt in the rigid posture of the Jelker, and a dawning, horrified confusion on the faces of the younger races who had always idolized the Concord's founders. The humans were about to speak, and Vorlag knew, with a certainty that chilled the very marrow of his being, that the silence that had reigned for 1,000 years was about to be broken forever. He felt a deep ancestral dread, a fear not of an external enemy, but of the rot that lies within, the decay of a truth that has been left to fester in the dark for too long. The humans had not come to negotiate. They had come to pass judgment. The human delegation entered. They walked with a slowness that was not ceremonial but deliberate, each step echoing in the cavernous chamber with an unnerving finality. They wore no ornate regalia, no shimmering fabrics or jeweled adornments favored by the other species. They were clad in simple, severe uniforms of the deepest black, the only color a small, silver insignia on their chests, a stylized representation of their home world, a blue marble of impossible fragility. At their head walked Ambassador Evelyn Reed. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, the simple, forward-facing eyes of a predator species, swept across the chamber, missing nothing. They did not show anger, not yet. They showed something far more unsettling, a profound and weary sorrow, the look of someone who has carried a terrible burden and has finally arrived at the place where it must be set down. She and her contingent stopped before the central platform, a disk of polished obsidian that floated above the chamber floor. She did not bow. She did not offer the traditional greetings of peace and respect. She simply stood, her hands clasped behind her back, and waited for the chamber to fall silent once more. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was not the silence of reverence, but the silence of a courtroom before the verdict is read. It was heavy, suffocating, and charged with an energy that felt like the moment before a lightning strike. Finally, Evelyn Reed spoke. Her voice, amplified by the chamber's acoustics, was clear, calm, and devoid of any discernible emotion. It was a voice that held the cold, hard purity of a diamond. "Members of the Galactic Concord," she began, her gaze sweeping across them all, lingering for a moment on Vorlag. "I stand before you today not as a representative of a junior partner, not as an apprentice to your ancient wisdom, but as the executor of a historical debt. For millennia, you have governed this galaxy. You have built an order based on a shared history, a shared sacrifice, a shared victory against a terrible foe. You have called this history the truth." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Vorlag felt a tightening in his thorax. He could feel the chemical signature of fear beginning to emanate from the other delegates, a sharp, acrid scent rising in the filtered air. The Jelker Primarch shifted his massive form, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Your tone is insolent, human," the Primarch's voice boomed. "You were summoned to explain the presence of your warships, not to lecture us on history." Evelyn Reed's eyes settled on the Jelker, and for the first time a flicker of something cold and hard entered her expression. It was not anger. It was a kind of focused pity, the look a physician might give to a patient whose disease is terminal. "I am not here to lecture," she said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing every being in the chamber into her orbit. "I am here to correct the record. The foundation of this Concord, the heroic war against the silicate scourge, is a lie." A shockwave of sound and color erupted through the chamber. The lumina flared with violent, chaotic light. The Jelker Primarch rose to his full, intimidating height, his stony fists clenching. Cries of outrage and disbelief echoed from 100 daises. Vorlag remained perfectly still, a statue of black obsidian. He felt as though the floor beneath him had vanished, leaving him suspended over an infinite abyss. The lie. The single, unassailable truth that had united them all, the story of their glorious, desperate stand against a hive-minded crystalline monstrosity that sought to consume all life. The bedrock. "Blasphemy," a voice shrieked, the representative of a SB. Esses whose world had supposedly been saved from the scourge by the Concord's founders. "You are young. You do not understand the sacrifices that were made." Reed waited for the tumult to subside, her calm a rock in a raging sea. When a semblance of order returned, she raised a hand, and a vast holographic display shimmered into existence in the center of the chamber. It was not the crisp, perfect projection of Concord technology. It was murky, filled with static and fragmented data like an image seen through dark, troubled water. "We did not understand," she agreed, her voice now resonating with a deep, sorrowful power. "And so we sought to. Our science is young, but it is relentless. We developed a technology we call chronoacoustic deep field resonance. It allows us to listen to the echoes of the past, to sift through the residual energy of ancient events, to reconstruct data from signals that have been broken and scattered for millions of years. We turned this technology to the great battlefields of the Scourge War, hoping to learn from your ancient heroism. The image in the hologram began to coalesce. It was a star chart, ancient and unfamiliar, but it was not a battle plan. It showed trajectories, countless of them all originating from a point far outside the galactic disk, all moving desperately inward. You told us the silicate scourge came from within the galaxy, an internal threat that rose to consume its neighbors. This is not what the echoes show. They show a civilization in flight. They were not invaders. They were refugees. The hologram shifted. It showed a crystalline vessel, vast and beautiful like a cathedral carved from a single diamond. It was broadcasting a signal. The signal was fragmented, distorted by time and interference, but the humans' technology had painstakingly pieced it together. A voice, a chorus of harmonic chimes and resonant frequencies filled the chamber. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Fleeing, it comes, the great silence, the eater of light, we seek shelter, we mean no harm. Please, does anyone hear us? We are the last. The message looped, a desperate, fading plea. Vorlag felt two of his 4 eyes close involuntarily. The sound was a spear through his soul. He had heard recordings of the Scourge's supposed battle cries, harsh, grating shrieks that the conquered archives presented as the sound of mindless aggression. This was the sound of a soul being extinguished. Your founders did not encounter an invading armada, Reed continued, her voice now trembling with a suppressed, righteous fury that was more terrifying than any shout. They encountered the final, desperate exodus of a terrified people. Perhaps they did not understand the language. Perhaps in their fear they saw only a threat in the unfamiliar. But the records that followed, the records they created after the conflict, were not a misinterpretation. They were a deliberate fabrication. The holographic display changed again. It showed a conquered vessel of an ancient design firing its primary weapon. The target was not a warship. It was a crystalline transport, unarmed, spilling smaller ships like seeds from a pod. The beam struck, and the beautiful ship shattered into a billion glittering fragments, a silent, horrific firework in the void. There was no return fire. There was only a final, despairing pulse of energy, a telepathic scream of agony that echoed even now, across millions of years, thanks to the humans' terrible, truth-seeing machine. They committed genocide. Reed's voice was now a blade. They slaughtered an entire civilization that had come to them for help, and then they built an empire on the graves of their victims. They crafted a story of a great evil to bind you all together in fear, to justify their authority, to create the very conquered that stands in this chamber today. For millennia, you have celebrated your saviors. We are here to tell you that you have been worshipping murderers. Chamber was utterly, deathly silent. The weight of the revelation was too vast to be comprehended. It was a truth that didn't just change history, it poisoned it. It rendered every treaty, every sacrifice, every monument meaningless. It was a lie so profound that it had become the very structure of their reality. Vorlag looked at the Jelker Primarch, whose stony face was, for the first time, a mask of pure, horrified shock. He saw the lumina dimming, their colors fading to a mournful, ashen gray. He felt his own ancient beliefs, the pride of the Cathar and their role as guardians of conquered tradition, crumbling into dust. Why, Vorlag heard his own voice ask, a dry rasp. Why would they do this? Why perpetuate the lie for so long? Evelyn Reed's gaze met his, and he finally understood the terrible burden he had seen in her eyes. It was not just the knowledge of the crime, but the knowledge of the motive. Because they were afraid, she said softly, and because the lie was easier thaw. And the truth, they built a wall of history to protect themselves from their own shame. But there was another reason. The silicate beings, the people you called the Scourge, were not just running. They were trying to warn us. She gestured to the hologram one last time. A new fragment of data appeared, pulled from the background radiation of the final, desperate transmissions. It was a simple diagram, a representation of their galaxy, and an arrow pointing to the vast, empty space between galaxies. And beside it, a single symbol repeated over and over, a symbol that pulsed with a deep, primal dread. The humans' translation software could not decipher the word, but it could interpret the emotional and conceptual data embedded within it. The word that appeared beneath the symbol in the chamber's universal script was not a name. It was a description. The enemy of structure. The silicate civilization was not the Scourge, Ambassador Reed declared, her voice ringing with the terrible clarity of prophecy. They were the first messengers. They were trying to tell you what was coming, the real threat, the thing that consumed their entire galaxy and forced them to flee across the void. Your founders, in their guilt and their terror, buried the warning along with the truth of their crime. They chose to build a comfortable lie rather than face an inconvenient apocalypse. She lowered her hand, and the holographic display vanished, plunging the chamber back into its somber, ancient light. The silence returned, but it was a new kind of silence. It was the silence of a universe that had suddenly grown infinitely larger, older, and more terrifying. "This is why we have come," she said, her voice now calm, the fury having passed, leaving behind only a grim, unwavering resolve. "The rage of my people is not for the ancient crime. We understand fear. We understand mistakes. What we cannot forgive, what has boiled in our souls since we uncovered this truth, is the perpetuation of the lie. The deliberate choice, generation after generation, to keep your children and new members like us in the dark, to build a future on a foundation of rot." She looked around the chamber at the stunned and shattered faces of the galactic leaders. "The Galactic conquered as you have known it is over. It died 1,000,000 years ago in a field of shattered crystal. Today, we have merely signed the death certificate. What rises in its place is up to all of us. But it will be built on truth, or it will not be built at all. The human armada in your sky is not here to threaten you. It is here to bear witness, to ensure that the truth, once spoken, is never again silenced." Ambassador Reed and her delegation then did something that broke all protocol, all tradition. They turned their backs on the council and walked slowly, deliberately back toward the great doors. They did not wait for a response. They did not ask for a vote. They had delivered their truth, and in their minds the matter was settled. The old order was broken. The lies were exposed. The rest was merely a matter of accepting reality. As the great doors began to close behind them, sealing the conquered in with its shame and its newfound terror, Vorlag finally understood the nature of humanity. Their emotion was not a weakness. It was the engine of their morality. Their rage was not the hot, chaotic fire of a primitive species. It was the cold, focused, righteous fury of a people who believed with every fiber of their being that some truths were worth burning a galaxy down to reveal. And in the suffocating silence of the chamber, surrounded by the ruins of 1,000 years of lies, Vorlag felt a strange and terrifying new emotion rise within him. Hope. The children of Earth had brought them a terrible truth, but they had also brought them a chance at redemption, and a warning of the true war that was to come. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and recrimination. The Grand Chamber, once a symbol of unity, became a crucible of fragmentation. The descendants of the Conquered's founding races, led by the Jelker Primarch, reacted with furious denial. They accused humanity of historical revisionism, of a brilliantly executed psychological attack designed to shatter the Conquered and allow humanity to seize power. They produced their own ancient records, the hallowed texts and data crystals that told the glorious story of the Scourge War. But the stories now rang hollow. The heroism felt brittle. Placed against the raw, emotional agony of the Silicate's final plea, their grand narratives seemed like the boastful fabrications of frightened children. The younger races, those who had joined the Conquered in the long millennia after its founding, were torn. They had been raised on these legends. Their cultures were interwoven with the shared history of the Conquered. To accept the humans' truth was to accept that their entire galactic identity was a sham. Many could not bear the weight of it. They retreated into silence, their representatives refusing to participate in the fractured debates, their worlds effectively seceding from the galactic dialogue. The Conquered was not just broken, it was dissolving. Vorlag and the Cathar delegation secluded themselves. He ordered a complete review of his own people's historical archives, cross-referencing them with the data the humans had presented. The Cathar were not founders, but they were an old race, one of the first to join the new order after the supposed war. Their records were meticulous, and as his archivists delved deeper, they found inconsistencies, small contradictions that had been overlooked for eons. A star system that was supposedly glassed by the Scourge showed evidence of Conquered founder weaponry. Timelines of fleet movements that did not match the official battle reports. Small, nagging questions that had been dismissed as clerical errors at the time, but when viewed through the lens of humanity's revelation, they formed a chilling pattern of deceit. On the third cycle after the humans' address, Vorlag requested a private audience with Ambassador Reed. She agreed. They met not in the poisoned atmosphere of the Grand Chamber, but aboard the human diplomatic vessel, the UNS Truth's Reckoning. The name itself was a statement. The interior of the ship was as stark and functional as their uniforms. There was no art, no ceremony. There was only purpose. They sat in a simple observation lounge, a vast window looking out at the citadel, which now seemed less a beacon of unity and more a gilded cage of lies. Ambassador Reed was dressed in the same severe black uniform. She did not offer him refreshments, an omission of protocol that Vorlag understood was not an insult, but a reflection of the gravity of their situation. There was no time for pleasantries. "You have verified our findings," she stated. It was not a question. "My archivists have found corroborating evidence," Vorlag confirmed, his voice a low rumble. "Small things, discrepancies, the seeds of the lie buried deep in our own records. We simply never had the perspective to see them for what they were." He paused, his 4 eyes gazing at the human. She was so small, so fragile compared to his own armored form, yet she possessed a strength that could shatter empires. "Your people, your rage, it is not what we expected. We have seen rage in young species before. It is always a storm, loud and destructive, and then it passes. Yours is cold, patient. It is the pressure of a glacier, not the fury of a fire." Evelyn Reed stared out at the citadel. "We have had to learn to control our emotions, Executor. On our own world, our passions nearly destroyed us on multiple occasions. We learned that rage, undirected, is a poison, but directed, channeled by logic and ethics, it becomes the most powerful tool for change in the universe. It is the engine that drives us to right injustice. We do not burn with anger at the crime of your founders. We boil with a cold rage at the structure of the lie they built. A structure that, by its very existence, dishonors the memory of the dead and endangers the future of the living." "You speak of memory as if it is a sacred thing," Vorlag observed. "For the Cathar, memory was a tool, a record of events. For humans, it seemed to be something more." "Memory is all we are," Reed replied, turning her gaze back to him. Her eyes were deep and held a profound, ancient sadness. "We are the sum of our stories. When those stories are built on lies, our very existence becomes a falsehood. For a species as short-lived as ours, the integrity of what we pass on is paramount. It is our only form of immortality. The silicate beings were denied that. Their memory was erased, replaced by a monstrous caricature. We see that as the ultimate sin. To not only kill a people, but to kill the truth of who they were." Vorlag contemplated this. It was a philosophy so alien, yet so undeniably powerful. The Cathar lived for centuries. They had the luxury of long perspective. Humans, in their fleeting lives, had developed a fierce, protective reverence for the truth of the past. It was the only anchor they had in the river of time. "And the warning?" Vorlag asked. "The enemy of structure." "Our primary concern," she said, her expression becoming grim. "The lie did more than just create a false history. It created a false sense of security. The conquered has spent 1,000,000 years preparing to fight the last war, a war that never even happened. You built fleets designed to combat the crystalline ships of a foe who did not exist. You established defensive doctrines based on a lie. All the while, the real threat has been moving toward us, cloaked by the void and by your own willful ignorance." A communications officer entered the room and handed Ambassador Reed a data slate. She looked at it, and a subtle shift occurred in her posture. The immense weight she carried seemed to grow heavier. "Executor," she said, her voice low. "The Jelker Primarch and the remaining founder species have just issued a formal decree. They have declared humanity a rogue state. They have branded our evidence as seditious propaganda. They have ordered our immediate surrender and have begun mobilizing their fleets." Vorlag felt a cold dread seep into his being. It was the last, desperate act of a regime that knew it was cornered. They would choose to start a war rather than admit a truth. "They are fools," he rumbled. "Their pride will be the end of us all." "Pride is the armor of the insecure," Reed said, setting the slate down. "But it will not be the end, not if others are willing to stand for the truth." She looked at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. It was not a plea. It was an invitation, a challenge. "The Cathar are respected, Executor. Your word carries weight. Your people value honor. Where will you stand? In the shadow of the old, comfortable lie, or in the harsh, uncertain light of the new truth?" This was the moment of schism, the point of no return. To side with humanity was to declare war on the very heart of the conquered, to shatter the last vestiges of the old order. To side with the founders was to become complicit in the lie, to dishonor the memory of the dead, and to walk blindly into the apocalypse the silicates had tried to warn them of. Vorlag thought of his people, of their long history of stability and tradition. He thought of the grand chamber of the millennia of peace, however false its foundations. And then he thought of the sound of that final, desperate plea, a chorus of chimes crying out in the darkness. He thought of the silent, crystalline ships shattering into dust. His duty was not to a structure. His duty, the duty of any sentient being, was to the truth. He rose to his full height, his carapace seeming to draw in the light from the room. "Ambassador," he said, his voice resonating with a finality that shook the very air. "The rage of humanity is justified. The lies of the conquered are at an end. The Cathar will not stand in the shadow. We will stand with you in the light." Evelyn Reed's expression did not change, but Vorlag sensed a minute release of tension in her. She gave a single, slow nod. "Then the work begins," she said. "The old conquered is dead. Now we must build something worthy of surviving what is coming." Vorlag's declaration sent a final, irreparable schism through the galaxy. The conquered civil war, as the historians would later call it, was not a war of conquest, but a war of ideology. It was a painful, brutal conflict fought not over territory, but over the nature of truth itself. The new alliance, a coalition led by humanity and the Cathar, and soon joined by the Lumina and a number of other races who chose to accept the painful reality, called themselves the Covenant of Truth. Against them stood the Old Guard, the Concordance loyalists, who fought with the desperate fury of those defending not just their power, but their very identity. The war was unlike any the galaxy had seen. The Loyalists fought with overwhelming numbers and ancient, powerful warships, but the Covenant, led by human strategists, fought differently. Human military doctrine was not about brute force. It was about information, precision, and psychological advantage. They used their deep field resonance technology to predict enemy fleet movements by analyzing the echoes of their jump drive activations. They waged a campaign of information, broadcasting the unedited silicate recordings into Loyalist systems, not as propaganda, but as raw, undeniable evidence. They turned the lie into a weapon against its creators, sowing dissent and doubt within the ranks of their enemies. Vorlag found himself in a position he had never imagined, a military commander in a galactic war. He coordinated the Cathar fleets, their powerful and resilient ships forming the backbone of the Covenant's defenses. He worked alongside human admirals, beings a fraction of his age who possessed a terrifying genius for strategy. He watched as they outmaneuvered fleets 10 times their size, as they disabled massive battle stations not with overwhelming firepower, but with surgical strikes on critical systems identified through impossibly complex data analysis. He saw that their approach to war was the same as their approach to truth. They did not use a sledgehammer. They used a scalpel. They dismantled their enemy's ability to fight piece by piece with a calm, logical, and relentless efficiency. The turning point came at the siege of the Jelker home system. A vast Loyalist armada stood ready to defend their capital, a fortress that had been considered impregnable for 500,000 years. The Covenant fleet, outnumbered, held its position. The galaxy watched, expecting a cataclysmic battle, but the battle never came. Instead, the humans broadcast a single, targeted message directly to the Jelker fleet. It was not a threat or an ultimatum. It was the complete, unredacted history of the Jelker's own first contact with the Conquered's founders, reconstructed from space-time echoes. It showed that the Jelker had not been uplifted, as their histories claimed. They had been a spacefaring race on the verge of FTL discovery, and the founders had suppressed their technology, forcing them into a subservient role in exchange for protection from the fictional scourge. The lie ran deeper than anyone had imagined. It had not just covered up a genocide. It had been used to build an empire through coercion and manipulation. Faced with the undeniable truth of their own subjugation, the Jelker fleet fractured. Ship after ship powered down its weapons. The Primarch, isolated and abandoned on his flagship, was faced with a choice: fight and die for a lie that had enslaved his people, or surrender to a truth that offered them freedom. He chose surrender. With the fall of the Jelkor, the Loyalist cause collapsed. The war was over. A new council was convened on the Citadel in the same grand chamber, but its atmosphere was transformed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a somber humility. Vorlag stood not as a delegate of a larger body, but as a co-founder of a new order. Beside him stood Ambassador Evelyn Reed. The black of their uniforms was no longer a symbol of mourning for the past, but of a grim resolve for the future. The Covenant of Truth was now the sole governing body of the galaxy. Its first and only law, etched into the wall behind the central dais where the lies had been told for so long, was simple. The truth, in all its complexity and its pain, shall be the only bedrock. Their work had just begun. The archives of every species were opened, every historical record re-examined. A new, true history of the galaxy began to be written, a painful and often shameful process, but a necessary one. But as they worked to heal the wounds of the past, they could not forget the warning about the future. The best human and Cathar scientists worked together, using the chronoacoustic technology to listen deeper into the void to find more traces of the silicate's flight. They focused their sensors on the void between galaxies, the direction from which the refugees had come. It was during a session of the New Covenant Council, as they were debating the protocols for a new, shared historical archive, that Ambassador Reed received an urgent message. She looked at her data slate, her calm expression finally breaking, replaced by a look of profound, chilling awe. "Executor Vorlag," she said, her voice quiet but carrying across the now hushed chamber. "Our long-range listening posts, they have found it, a clear signal. It is not from the silicates, it is ancient, far older." She projected the information into the center of the chamber for all to see. It was not a message of words or images. It was a stream of pure mathematics and physics, a universal language. It described a structure, a thing so vast it defied comprehension. It was a shell, an artificial sphere constructed not around a star, but around the entire local group of galaxies. The signal was a repeating diagnostic, a status report from a single, automated beacon left behind. The data was impossibly old, predating most of the stars in their own galaxy. "What is this?" Vorlag asked, his mind struggling to grasp the scale of what he was seeing. "We believe," Reed said, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and wonder, "that it is a containment field, a cage, built by a civilization or a coalition of civilizations so ancient they make the Concord's founders look like infants." The data stream continued to resolve, translating the core concepts. It described the thing the structure was designed to contain. It was not an organism, not an empire. The translated concept was chillingly simple, a logical inconsistency in the fabric of reality. A thing that did not follow the laws of physics because it was from a state before physics. The enemy of structure, the eater of light. The silicates had not been fleeing a ravenous alien species. They had been fleeing a hole in the universe, a patch of primordial chaos that was beginning to expand, to consume cosmic order. Then the final piece of the signal resolved. It was not part of the diagnostic. It was an addendum, added at a much later date, though still impossibly ancient. It was a warning left by the builders of the Great Cage before they had vanished, or transcended, or been consumed themselves. The message was simple and horrifying. The field is failing. The anomaly is adaptive. It learns. It has learned to mimic the resonance of order. It HIDES within complex SYSDMS. It is drawn to the light of organized civilization. Your conquered, your empires, your cities of light. You have not been building a civilization. You have been lighting a beacon. A profound, absolute silence fell upon the grand chamber. The lie that had defined their past was a trivial thing, a squabble of children compared to this. The great enemy was not a fleet of ships that could be fought. It was a creeping negation of existence itself, a fundamental unraveling of the laws that held them all together. And their entire history, their drive to unite and build, had been inadvertently calling it toward them. Vorlag looked from the terrifying data display to the faces of his new allies. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw something else. He saw the same grim, unyielding resolve he had first seen in the eyes of Evelyn Reed. They had torn down a kingdom of lies, only to find themselves on the shore of an ocean of absolute, cosmic horror. The rage of humanity had boiled over, and it had cleansed the galaxy of its self-deception. But now, standing in the cold, hard light of the truth, they could all see the real storm that was gathering in the dark. Their work was not over. The true war, the war for reality itself, had just begun, and for the first time in a million years, they were facing it with their eyes wide open.